Hello and welcome to the recap for Practical 6 for Scripting for Interactive Media. So this week we left off from our interactive content. So we had some way of interacting with the world using our line trace system that allowed us to open doors, turn on lights, and anything else we might want to interact with in the game world. This week we're going to take a look at our audio, and we're specifically going to look at a few different types of audio. So we're going to look at how to add audio specifically into the game world itself. So when we then play our game, we'll have audio coming from different locations within the game world. Before we do that, we need to make sure that our audio is in the correct format. So we're going to do that by opening up Adobe Audition, which is installed on the university computers. I've already opened up Audition. There isn't too much we need to do. We just need to make sure we change our bit depth to be 16-bit. Anything else Unreal does not support. So if you try bringing in something like a 24-bit audio file, you'll find that Unreal won't be able to bring it in. So inside Audition, all we need to do is find the audio we've downloaded. Now in my case, I've just downloaded mine from Freesound. A lot of this is Creative Commons and copyright free, so you should be able to use most of this inside of your game. So I've downloaded a few audio clips. I've specifically got some water sounds for the waterfall. I've also downloaded some footsteps, and I've also got a door creaking sound that I think I'm going to use as well. Now on Moodle, there are footstep sound clips, and you can use those as well inside of your game. We'll come back to that. We're going to set that up as part of our interaction, so whenever our character walks, the footstep sounds play at the same time. So back in Audition, what we'll need to do is import our file into the Files section here, and you do that by right-clicking, and we click Import. From here, if you find where you saved your audio clips, so just make sure you've taken them out of the Downloads folder, put them somewhere safe, ideally in the same folder as your game. Now I've got one of mine here, so I'll show you how to set this up. So I've just opened it, and when I preview this, we get the audio playing. So you'll notice if I scroll along, the bit depth for my audio here is 24 bits. And Unreal won't be able to support that, so we'll have to convert that somehow. Now the easiest way to do this is to go to File, and we can simply just go to Export, Export for File, and what we'll need to do here is change the sample type. So where it says Change on Sample Type, you see we have options here for changing the bit depth. Now, it was previously set to 24, I changed mine to 16. We can also set the sample rate to either 44.1 or 48 kilohertz or 48,000 hertz. So usually a good option. We'll just click OK. You can change the name of your file here. A lot of the files coming from Freesound end up with quite strange and long names, so maybe name it something that makes a bit more sense. So I've already named mine Waterfall Audio, and then I've got my door creak already set up. So you would just save it from there, and that's all you need to do for your audio inside of Audition to get it ready for Unreal. So now that we've got our audio set up, ready to use, I'm going to switch back to Unreal, and now we can start bringing that audio in to our game's engine. So I'm going to do that. The first thing I'm going to do is make a new folder for storing my sound. And I'm going to do that by right-clicking in the content browser. We'll do our new folder, and we'll call this Audio. And then we'll just double-click on that to open that folder up. Now anything that's not created directly in Unreal is stored inside this content browser, so that includes anything that we import, such as audio. Now you can import that from this import option to Game Audio. Let's click Import, and then if we find where we saved our audio, so in this case I'll bring in my waterfall audio here, and I might just bring in my door creak for later too. So this is just a very simple creaking door sound that I can then use for the triggering of my door interaction. So let's click Open. If they're successfully imported, you should see that you can then preview the audio clips by playing them as a thumbnail in here. So if I play this, I should be able to hear my audio play back. Perfect. Okay, so now what we'll need to do is we can now that it's been brought in, we can actually bring this into the game world and we can work with it. So what we can do is I'm going to click and drag this waterfall audio. I want to use it to replicate the sound of the water falling down here. So let's just click and drag on that audio clip and we'll drop it into the scene. Now this should work straight away. As soon as I play the game, you should now be able to hear the audio. So let's test that out. There we go, the audio is playing. But if I go further away from the audio source, you'll notice it doesn't get any quieter, and it doesn't actually change at all. So at the moment our audio is specifically set up to just play throughout the entire level, and it won't change pitch or volume no matter where we go. The reason for that is our spatial attenuation is not enabled. And you see if I click on my audio clip, it appears as a little loudspeaker icon. If you scroll down in your details panel for your audio, you have an option here called attenuation. If you click the option here that says override attenuation, what you'll find is that an orange sphere appears around your audio source. If I zoom out, you'll see an even further or an even bigger orange sphere is surrounding that. And this is the fall off. So anywhere in this central sphere, the audio will be at its full volume. Anywhere in between the central sphere and that outer sphere is the fall off distance. So as we get further away, the audio will start to fade out. Now, you can change these. Both of these spheres' sizes can be changed. If you scroll down, we have options here for attenuation distance. And we have inner radius and fall off distance. So I'm going to bring the fall off distance really far down just so we can see what's going on here. Let's just make that much smaller. And then let's play and we'll see what happens then. So as I walk away, the audio starts to fade out. So that's the idea behind our spatializing our audio, so we can actually set it up so that it is set within our game world, and we can actually then use it as a way of engaging players and drawing players into different areas and giving objects maybe just a bit more definition. Okay, so once we've done that, we can now look at some different types of audio, slightly more interactive audio. I could bring in lots of different types of audio into my content browser and use it in different ways. Let's just go in and do something that's maybe a bit more interactive. So the perfect thing for us to do would be, when I play my game, I'd like for this door to make a noise whenever I opened it. So this is just following on from our last tutorial where I set up this door interaction. It swings open when we click on it, and it swings closed when we click on it again. So ideally I'd like to be able to play some audio when that opens up. Unfortunately, what we can do is we can make sure that we use the blueprint that we've already created for that door, so we don't actually have to bring anything else in. So I want this door creak to play when I open this door. So just a really simple door creak. It's not too distracting, it's just subtle enough that it gives a sense that the door is a bit older, it's maybe needs a bit of repair. So let's bring that in to our blueprint that we already set up for our door interaction. So I'm going to go back to my content folder here. I stored mine in my blueprints folder, and I've got mine called BP old door. Again, if you have a different name, just make sure you know where you're saving it. So BP old door, let's open that up. So when we set this up last time, we had our event on interact. So when we interact with this, it triggers this door rotation animation to play, and it sets our rotation to the correct point. So what I would like to have happen is whenever we click the play button, we trigger some audio to play. And we can do that very easily by setting a node in between the flip-flop node I've set up here and the door rotation node. And we're going to look for a node called play sound at location. And this is a node we're going to be using quite a lot. So it's play sound at location. All it does is play a sound at a location. So you see we have two options, sound and location. So what we want to have happen here is when we click on our interact, it triggers the audio first and then plays the animation. So I'm going to disconnect this A connection to the flip-flop by holding Alt and clicking on it. Then we'll click and drag out and connect the play sound at location in between those. Just make sure you set that back to play. So from here, we need to set the sound up correctly. We'll need to click on the sound drop down, and we'll need to select, we called ours door creak. There it is. Now what I'm going to do is I'm also going to bring in another play sound at location so we can set that up in the same place, but this time for the reverse pipeline. So let's hold Alt, disconnect, click drag B, and we'll this time remember to connect it back up to the reverse. What's nice about using these two nodes is if you wanted two different sounds for the door, one with the door opening and a different sound for the door closing, is you could set this up. I could have, say, two different door sounds, and I could then select the correct asset accordingly to whatever the door is doing. In this case, I'm just going to use the same one, though. So we'll just search for door creak, And that's actually us set up. This should hopefully work. So I'm going to hit compile, and I'll close this just now. Let's play our game and see what happens. So here the audio plays when the door opens. If I close the door, that audio plays again. So we've set up a way of triggering the audio to link with the interaction. So we don't need to do anything else really with that. We can go in, we can add any audio we like, and that should trigger at the same time that we interact. So they're working from the exact same system, which works great. Another feature you might want to do with audio would be to be able to trigger audio within a specific point in the game world. So an example, maybe you want, you have your character has some sort of dialogue, and you want to trigger that dialogue to play when your character gets to a specific point in your game world. So perhaps in my example we navigate through here, and I want a specific sound to play when the character passes this threshold of the building. So what we can do for this is we can make use of something called the level blueprint. The level blueprint it's essentially it's a blueprint that's accessed by the whole of the level, and it's just specific to the entire environment. So that means that we can set up something called a trigger box. And our trigger box can then, as our player character passes through the trigger box, we then say to play a sound wherever that player character is. So let's set that up. So the first thing we'll need to do is we'll actually need to get a trigger box for us to actually trigger the audio to play. And you can do that by coming over to your modes panel. I'm just going to look in the basic tab here. Second from bottom, we have a box trigger. You have a sphere trigger as well. They're both pretty much the exact same. The only difference is the shape of the overlap. So you can try them out and see which one works best for your situation. I'm going to bring in the box trigger though. And let's just make sure that we can drop that into our game world here. So I'll bring that a little bit closer. Move that over there. Okay, so there's my trigger box. Okay, let's make sure we rotate that. And I want it to make sure that the length of this box covers the entirety of this door here. If it doesn't, then the player might pass through and completely miss this, and your audio is not going to trigger. So if it's really important, make sure the trigger box fits the full length, and the player is always actually going to pass over it. They only have to overlap with it. They don't have to fill the entirety of the trigger box. So if you make it smaller than the player character, that's fine. This should still work. Okay, so now that we've got that set up, we've got a trigger box. Now we need to actually tell it to do something when the player passes over it. And again, we're going to use our level blueprint rather than making a brand new separate blueprint in here. We're going to go up to our blueprints option in the top. And you should see about halfway down we have an option here called Open Level Blueprint. So we're going to click on that and we'll open it up. So the interface is exactly the same, and it should work pretty much exactly the same as well. But one of the nice features about the level blueprint is it's working specifically with all of the assets that are currently within the game level. So what's nice about this is when I click on, say, that trigger box, if I want to make some reference to it, as long as it's selected in my environment, and this will help if you move your blueprint panel just to the side so you can click on the things in your scene. With that trigger box selected, I can right click in my event graph for my level blueprint, and you see that I have options based on just this specific trigger box. Now actually before I do that, I would maybe want to rename it. It's currently just called trigger box here, and I think ideally we'd like to set that up as a different name. So something that maybe makes a little bit more sense. Let's see if we can rename that to interior audio trigger. So that's the trigger box that plays the audio for my game. So I've still got that selected. If I now right click in my event graph, it brings up lots of options specifically related to that trigger. And what I'm looking for is if I click the drop down for the add event for interior audio trigger, we're looking for collision. And you see add on actor begin overlap. And that's exactly what we need. Anytime an actor overlaps with this trigger box, audio should play. And we want to say, well, we want that to be our player character. When our player character overlaps with the trigger box, the audio should then play. So let's bring that in. So we'll click Add Actor, Begin Overlap. And I'll just maybe scale this up a bit so we can see what's going on. Okay, now all we need to do is we need to drag out of our executable here, and we're going to say play sound at location. So the same node we used earlier. Now, currently we don't have a location set up. Or we do, it's set to 0, 0, and 0. So the sound is not going to necessarily play in the correct place. So what we'll need to do is get ourselves a location. Before I do that, let's bring in our sound. And I'm just going to bring in maybe an explosion sound, just so we can hear this actually working. But this could be anything. It could be your dialogue. It could be maybe sounds in the distance that you want to use to help the player know they're on the right track, or you want to just distract them from something in the game. You can absolutely do that. I'm just going to choose this explosion. This one comes with a starter content, so we can just use that. What I'm going to do is I need to use my location, and ideally I would like the sound, if I wanted this sound to be, say, the sound of the character talking, I want to play wherever the character currently is. So we're going to do a node called get player character. And then let's select this, and we'll need to get world, get actor location. There we go. So what we've done there is we have then converted our character object reference into something that can be read for location. So our yellowy orange color, remember, is our vector value. So we've converted the current object reference, which is our player character, and then we're going to convert that into something that can be read by this location. So now we connect that up. What should happen is whenever we overlap with that trigger box, explosion 1 should play, and the audio will actually play at the location of our player character. So let's just hit compile, and I'll close my level blueprint. Let's press play, and we'll see what happens. Okay, so you hear the audio plays because our character passed the trigger box. Now if I pass back over this, the audio plays again. Now that might be useful if you specifically want the audio to keep triggering whenever the character passes over it, but if you want the audio just to play once, you will need to set up something a little bit different. So if we keep it like this, the audio will constantly keep triggering every time we pass over that player, over that trigger box. Let's just go back out of there. I'm going to go back to my blueprint, and I'm going to open up my level blueprint here. So what I'm going to do instead is, once the audio plays, I want to then basically get rid of the trigger box so it doesn't play any more audio. And we can fortunately use a very straightforward node here, and if you right click, it's called destroy actor. And what that's going to do is it's going to destroy this trigger box. So it basically means that whenever the audio is played once, the trigger box then disappears from the game world, meaning the audio will never trigger again. So we just need to set destroy actor between the trigger box and the play sound at location. So let's listen to that now. Let's open the door. The sound plays. And then if we go back the way, notice the sound no longer plays. So this is perfect if you just need to set up one specific piece of audio. So if you have the character talking, perhaps you don't want the character to keep repeating it as they pass over the same part of the game, especially if the character or the player maybe backtracks a little bit and it sounds a bit strange having the character just repeat what they've just said. Perhaps you could use this system to stop that from happening. Okay, so we've so far looked at ways of adding specific audio tracks and audio to play at specific points in our game based on where we are. We've also added audio to our interactive objects, so as that door opens, our audio plays. And we've also looked at how to add audio specifically into our game world that will just play forever based on the location. So the next thing what I would like to do is, ideally I'd like to have some sort of sound for my player character. At the moment, there's no sounds of footsteps. It sounds very strange that our character isn't making any sort of impact or any noise within the game world. So I'm going to set up a system that makes use of our footsteps. And this is where the files for the footstep sound clips from week 6 would come in very handy. Feel free to download these and you can make use of them as well. Okay, so back in my game here, I'm going to go back to my content folder and we'll go back to our audio. I'm actually going to make a new folder inside of here just to store those sound clips. So we've actually got 5 footstep sounds. You can download them. Just make sure you bring them in and import them in the same way. So you'd import and then just bring them in. So I've got footsteps, the 5 footsteps, we can bring them in from here. They're already set up, ready to go, so you don't have to change the bit depth. They should already be suitable for Unreal. So I'm just going to click and drag to select them all, and let's import these. Now actually I may want to make a new folder in here just to keep this organized. So I'm going to right click and we'll do a new folder, and we'll call this one Footsteps. And now let's just shift click, so I'm clicking on the first one, holding shift, and let's click on step 5, and then we'll just drag them into that Footsteps folder, click on move here, and then that should just copy them across. There we go. So Footsteps are inside the Footsteps folder. Now what we want to have happen is we've got 5 different footsteps. How do we tell our character to make use of all of them? So we're going to set up something called a sound cue. And a sound cue is similar to our material blueprint or a material editor. It's a way of connecting multiple sound effects into one relationship. So what we're going to have happen is we want to randomly select one of these footsteps to play, then we wait a little bit, and then it'll randomly select another one. So we get a bit more of a natural sounding movement from our player character. So we'll set these up with a sound cue. So I'm going to do that by right clicking in the content browser here. We're going to go to sounds, just here, and we're going to look for this option here called sound cue. Let's click on that. And we're going to call this one SC for sound cue, and we'll call it footsteps. Okay, so let's open that up now. So if you double click on the text at the bottom here to open up the sound cue editor, at the moment all you'll have is an output. So very much like our material editor where we have the list of all the different types of outputs for our material, we only have one output option here for our footsteps. So now we need to bring those footsteps into this sound cue to make use of them. So we can easily do that. Probably the easiest way is just to give yourself a bit of space with the sound cue viewer here. So we'll just move that aside. Just click on the first audio clip, so click on step 1, hold shift, click on step 5, and then what you can do is if you click and drag from your content browser, we can just click and drag and we'll drop it into our sound cue. So these will now be accessible by our output. At the moment though, the output has only got one node that we can connect into, and we need to be able to connect up these 5 to make sure that it randomly selects one of these nodes to play. So we can use a connection node called random. And if I just right click and I search for random, let's bring that in. You'll see that you'll have to add inputs. So at the moment there's only 2 inputs. Let's just click it until we've got 5 inputs. So from here we connect up each step to each of the inputs on the random node. And there we go. And finally, if I connect my output up to the output node, we've now connected all of our audio up. And what this is going to do, this random node, is it's going to randomly select one of these nodes to play. And you can actually check whether it's working by clicking the play cue node at the top. And you see it's just randomly selecting a node to play. And this gives us a bit more variation. It's based on that procedural generative sound. So this should hopefully give you a bit more variation, make it feel a little bit more natural. So let's hit save. And we can now close the sound cue, so we actually don't need that anymore. We can always go back and change things in here as well. And one thing you might want to do is in the output node, you'll notice here you can change the volume and also the pitch. So if you did want to maybe make it a bit quieter, you can absolutely do that from this output node here as well. So this can be changed. But we're just going to close this right now. So our sound cue is now set up, ready for our player character to make use of. So what we're going to do is we'll need to go back to our player character blueprint. So we've been using that quite a lot. Let's keep everything together inside of there. I'm going to go back to my content browser. I've got mine in my Blueprints folder, and then I've got BP player character there. So let's double click on BP player character to open it up. So what we need to do now is set up a way of triggering the footsteps to play whenever our character moves. So there's a little bit we need to think about here. Is we want to make sure that our character is moving. So if the character is not moving, then obviously we don't necessarily want our audio to play. So what we're going to do first is we're going to make something called a variable. And our variable is actually just going to store our information to check whether the player character is moving or not. So it's storing that information. Is it moving? Then we can then reference to that later on. We can do that with this tab down here called variables. Now I've already made my variable, so what I'll do is I'll delete that and then we'll just make a new one from scratch. So in your variables folder here, you should see there's a little plus and we can make a brand new variable. So I'm going to click that. And you should see that in our variables here, it says new var underscore 0. So I'm going to rename this one to isWalking. And I'm just going to tap enter. So this is a variable that we can then make use of. It's going to store information. And you see at the moment it is red. It's got this red icon. And this indicates a Boolean value, or a Boolean variable, which is basically true or false. We can have two states. It can either be true or it can be false, which is perfect for our player character. We want to say, well, if the character is walking, it sets this value to be true. If it's not walking, it sets it to be false. And we can base whatever we want to have happen on those two values. So what we're going to do is we want to set this to be true when we actually press the movement controls. So we want that to be true when we press W, A, S, and D to move around. Then we say, yes, our character is moving. So I'm going to click and drag this isWalking variable into my scene. So let's click that. I'm going to drop it. When you let go, you'll get two options. You can either get isWalking or you can set. So if I set it, then whatever happens here will set this value to be either true or false. If I click on the get option, it's just making reference to it. So this is useful, and we will make use of this in a second. But at the moment, let's click on the set isWalking. And from here, what I want to do is I want to connect these up between the move forward and the add movement input. So whenever I press W, I set the isWalking to be true. So I'll need to disconnect the input here. So hold Alt and we'll click on the executable line. We'll set up the set node there, and then we'll just connect that up in between. Now we do want to make sure that we check this box here, because when we do actually press this button, we want to set that option to be true. So just make sure you click on the little checkbox there. Now what you might want to do is also to then copy and paste this. So we'll do Control-C, Control-V to make a copy, and we'll do the exact same down here. So let's disconnect and reconnect this back up. And we can leave that checked as well. So now that we've got a way of setting this variable to be either true or false based on what our character is doing. So whether we're walking, if we're pressing our axis keys, it's set to be true. If we're not, then this gets reset and it turns back to false. So now we've got some way of referencing whether our character is actually walking. So what we can do next is we'll need to make sure we've got a couple of other things that are just checking that our character is moving correctly. So I'm going to move over to the side here and we'll bring in some nodes over here. Okay, so the first node I'm going to look for is a node called getVelocity. And what this is going to do is it's going to check how fast our character is walking. And you'll notice that the target is set to self, so it is our player character. We can just leave that. What that means though is that we can check whether our character is moving at the correct speed. So if our character is moving too slowly, an example might be perhaps they're sliding slowly maybe down a hill or something like that, where you actually don't necessarily want the footsteps to play. Or perhaps they're falling, or they're climbing ladders or something like that. You wouldn't necessarily want the same footsteps to play based on that alone. So we want to just check that our character is meant to be walking at the correct speed. So I'm going to drag out the return value of the get velocity. I'm going to look for a node called vector length. And we're going to bring that in there. And what this does is it allows us to then change this value to a float. So our float value is, it's just a number, and it's a number that we can then use. So we can say if our character is walking faster than, say, a certain speed like 100, then the audio should play. If they're not walking that fast, the audio won't play. So this can be useful if your character has a crouch ability where they perhaps walk slower. You maybe don't want these really fast footsteps to play based on the character's crouched ability. So now that we've got our vector length, we need to actually then set up how fast should that character have to walk before the audio starts playing. So let's bring this in. We're going to look for a node called float greater than float. So float greater than float. If this value is greater than, so if our player character's value is greater than the value we type in here, the audio should then play. So let's set that to be 100. We could maybe set that up at something different later, and this can obviously be adjusted at whichever point. Okay, so now we've got a way of checking whether our character is moving and at a speed of 100 or more. And we've also then determined that this is walking will be set when we use our arrow keys to move around. Next thing we need to do is we're going to bring in a node called event tick. This is one of the most common nodes. What this does is it checks every frame whether these values are true. And if they are or aren't, then it will update accordingly. So if we don't have this, what will happen is when I start walking, it'll immediately set this to be true, but then when I let go, it'll set these, it won't reset these. So what will happen is the audio will keep playing even after I let go of the arrow keys for the first time. So this is basically just checking if things have been updated. So this is a really useful node. So let's make use of this. And we want a way of connecting this up to this get velocity. So I'm going to bring this in, and I'm going to search for a node called branch. And remember, our branch is just a way of checking whether a condition is true or false, and then we can then do something based on whether it is true or false. So what I'm going to do is connect up my Boolean output to the condition of that branch. So we're saying, okay, so if our velocity is greater than 100, we want something to happen. If it's not, we don't want that to happen. And what we want to have happen is obviously our audio to play. I have not yet made any reference to this is walking node here though. So let's bring that in now. So ideally I want to have to press the keys for the footsteps to play. I don't really want the character to be jumping and the footsteps to be playing. So let's bring in the true node here. We'll drag out of true, and we're actually going to bring in another branch. So you can actually keep using these as a way of setting up logic to see whether different conditions have been fulfilled, and if they have, then something can happen. So I'm going to bring in this is walking. So we've already set that over here. So let's click and drag the is walking boolean into our scene, and this time we're going to do get, not set. We don't want to set it here. We just want to check whether it is set to be true or false. So we'll do get, and then we'll connect that up to the condition of that branch. So now we've got two conditions that are being checked. So are we going faster than 100, and are we actually pressing the keys? Okay, so now we've got something we can now set up to check whether our character should play those footstep sounds. And we're going to say true. So let's click and drag out of here, and let's do play sound at location. That was our same node that we've been using for the past few examples. So play sound at location. You'll notice we have a drop down again for our sound asset. This time let's bring in footsteps. Oh, I think it was SC footsteps. Yes, there it is. SC footsteps. Let's bring that in. Okay, and the location we actually don't need to change because we're already working inside of our player character blueprint, so it actually defaults it to wherever the player character's center point is, which is fine. That's exactly where we want it to be set up. So let's hit compile, and let's try this out. Now, this should hopefully work, but what we might find is it does still sound a little bit strange. So, I'm playing. So far so good. We don't have any audio playing because I'm not moving yet. So let's see what happens when we press W to move. Okay, not great. So, it works. Whenever I move, sound does play, but obviously it's so quick that it doesn't sound natural at all. So what we're going to do to fix this is go back to our player character blueprint, and we're going to set up a node in between this that just delays the time in between these sounds being played. The reason it's playing so fast is because of this event tick. It's checking every single frame, and if that's true, it's then re-triggering the audio to play. So that's why it sounds so quick, is it's checking every frame and then just replaying at the start of every frame. So we're going to actually add a node in here that says to not do that for a certain amount of time. So I'm going to disconnect that true value. We'll drag out a true here, and we're going to look for a node called delay. It's a flow control delay. And what this is going to do is it's going to wait a certain value before it'll play the sound again. And depending on the types of footsteps you've used, then you may need to change this value. I'm going to set mine to be 0.4. I think for these footsteps should work okay. Let's hit compile, and we'll try this out. Okay, so that speed that feels a bit more natural now. So when I stop, the audio stops as well. One problem you might notice though, is that if I jump, notice that the audio keeps playing, which isn't ideal. It feels a bit strange. So what we'd like to do is to check whether our character is jumping, and if they are, we don't really want the audio to play. And this also goes for falling as well. So if the character's just not touching the ground, we don't want that audio to play. So let's set that up. And this should be the last thing we'll need for this. So let's go back to our player character, and we're actually going to set up another branch in between the delay and the play sound at location. So I'm actually going to disconnect the completed node from the delay. We're going to bring in another branch, and we need to check this condition. Now, Unreal already has this pre-built function to check whether this is true or false, and it's actually already called something like is falling. And you see, as you start typing is falling, you have this reference to the character movement. So what this is doing is checking whether is your character actually touching the ground or are they falling. So we can then connect that value up to the branch, and from here we can then set this back up to the play sound location. We just need to make sure we're setting up the correct output. What's happening is we don't want the sound to play when the character is in the air. And what this is doing is, if the character is falling, then that's set to be true. So we wouldn't want the sound to play while this is true. So instead we want to connect up the false to that play sound location. Okay, let's compile and we'll give this a go. So the footsteps play, and hopefully when I jump, the sound stops. Perfect, that's exactly what we're after. So I've stopped the character from being able to play that audio whenever they stop touching the ground, so when they jump or when they fall, that should stop. Okay. So that sort of covers most of the audio that you will probably need for this this prototype at least. Now, one of the problems with this setup is that we are just using one type of footstep sound. So this might sound okay on these wooden floorboards, but if I was to suddenly go and walk on the grass or the water, then you will find that that does cause some issues. It'll be playing the same footstep sounds. What I will do is, in a separate video tutorial, I'll show you how to set up a system that will let you set up different types of footsteps for different materials. But if you want to leave it at that for a prototype, if you start running out of time, I'd much prefer that you just leave it at that. We don't need to worry too much about the footsteps. I'd rather you focus kind of on your narrative aspects. What you may want to do instead of, if you don't want to use the footsteps from Moodle, you could instead use maybe some more generic footsteps. These have got quite a lot of echo on them. They don't sound so generic. So if you could perhaps find something that's maybe not so wooden sounding that could be used over different materials, you might get away with that instead. Now, we could, I suppose, try and fix the footsteps here. We could go into our audio, our footsteps, and we could go open up this the sound cue for our footsteps. We could click on the output, and remember we can change the volume and the pitch. We could try this. We could say maybe they're just too loud. Let's set them at 0.5. We could maybe set the pitch down to 0.8, so they're a bit lower, so we don't get that crack of the kind of wooden sound as we hit the ground. We can see what that sounds like. I think it's still a little bit loud. Let's turn that down a bit more. So 0.3. Save. Okay, so maybe not quite so noticeable now. But I think that's more than usable for a prototype. I don't think we'd need to worry too much about setting up another system for this. But in a future tutorial, I will show you how to set that up for different materials, and you can make use of that in your game if you feel like you've got time to do that. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. This should hopefully cover everything you need for your audio.